The second time my brother stole my grandmother's house, I was standing in the hallway of the Halloran County Probate Court with my hand on a manila folder that contained every piece of evidence he'd spent 16 months forging, and I was wearing a navy blazer he'd never seen before, and my hair was cut in a way he didn't recognize, and when he looked at me from across the room, his face did something I'd been waiting 18 months to see. It went blank. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, how can someone steal a house twice? The answer is that the first time I let him, not on purpose. I let him the way you let water out of a crack in a glass, slowly, without noticing, until the glass is empty and you're holding the shape of something that used to hold something. The second time, I didn't let him. The second time, I handed him the glass and watched him drink. If you're new here, welcome to Elena's Rebirth life, where betrayal never gets the final word. I need to start with my grandmother, May Calloway. She raised me from the time I was 9, after my father, her son, drove his truck off Route 14 on a Tuesday night in November, and my mother decided that single motherhood was not the life she'd signed up for. My mother, Vivian, didn't disappear. She just relocated 31 miles east to a condo in Westbrook with a man named Dale who sold insurance and wore cologne you could taste. She called on birthdays. She sent checks for amounts that ended in odd numbers as if the imprecision were accidental, as if she hadn't calculated down to the dollar exactly how little she could send without feeling guilty. I learned later that she kept a spreadsheet. Grandmother May lived in a 2-story house on Birch Lane. White clapboard, green shutters, a rosemary bush by the front steps that she'd planted the year I was born. The house smelled like rosemary and old wood and the lemon polish she used on the kitchen table every Friday. She was a retired school librarian. She read to me every night until I was 13 and told her I was too old, and she said, "You're never too old for someone to read to you, Nora," and she kept reading, and I let her because her voice was the sound of safe. Warren was my older brother. He was 5 years ahead of me, which meant that by the time I was in middle school, he was already gone. A business degree from a state college, a job in commercial real estate, a leased silver Lexus that he parked in Grandmother May's driveway on the 3 holidays a year he visited. Warren was the kind of person who remembered your birthday and forgot to ask how you were. He'd come to the house on Birch Lane and sit in the kitchen and talk about property values while Grandmother May made tea and I sat in the corner and nobody asked me anything because Warren was the one with the degree and the Lexus, and I was the one who'd stayed. I stayed. That's the thing I keep coming back to. I stayed. After high school, I got my CNA certification and started working as a home health aide, first for an agency, then privately, and I moved into the spare bedroom on Birch Lane, and I took care of Grandmother May because she was 81 and her knees were bad and her hands shook when she poured tea, and she needed someone, and I was there. Warren sent money sometimes. He called it contributing. It was $400 a month, which was less than my phone bill and my groceries combined, but Grandmother May said he was busy, he had a career, he was doing his best, and I said okay because arguing with Grandmother May about Warren was like arguing with the rosemary bush about the weather. The will was simple. Grandmother May had written it 12 years ago with an attorney named Judith Mercer, whose office was above a bakery on Clifton Avenue. The house on Birch Lane, the savings account, the rosemary bush, all of it to me, not because she loved Warren less, because I was there, because I'd been there every day for 9 years, changing the bandages on her knees, driving her to appointments, sitting with her on the porch in the evenings while she told me about Grandfather Calloway and the year they'd planted the rosemary and the way the light came through the kitchen window in October. The will wasn't a reward, it was a fact. I was the one who stayed. Warren found out about the will on a Sunday in August. Grandmother May had mentioned it, casually, the way you mention something obvious, the way you'd say, the sky is blue. And Warren's face had done something I'd seen before, a tightening around the jaw, a small recalibration behind the eyes, the face of a man hearing a number he doesn't like. He didn't say anything, he drank his tea, he left. But I saw the jaw, I saw the eyes, and I should have known I should have known the way you know when a dog stops growling and goes quiet, that the quiet was worse than the growl. I didn't know. I was 26 and I was tired, and I was the kind of person who believed that family meant what it was supposed to mean. I kept going to work, I kept changing bandages, I kept sitting on the porch. Grandmother May turned 83 in September, and in October she fell. A small fall, the kind that happens when you're 83 and your knees are bad and the bathroom tile is wet. And she broke her hip, and the hospital stay was 9 days, and when she came home, she was different, smaller, quieter. Her handwriting, which had been steady for 83 years, started to wander. She'd sign her name, and the M would drift up and to the right, as if the pen had ideas of its own. I noticed. I didn't think about it. I had other things to think about. I was working double shifts to cover the hospital bills. Insurance didn't. I was sleeping 4 hours a night. I was making tea at 6 a.m. and bandaging knees at 11 p.m. And somewhere in between, I was supposed to notice that my brother had started visiting more often and sitting with Grandmother May alone and talking to her in a low voice in the kitchen while I was at work. And I didn't notice because I was too tired to notice, and because I trusted him. Because he was my brother, and because trust, when you're tired, is easier than suspicion. Grandmother May died on March 3rd, a Tuesday. She was in her bed, in the room with the rosemary bush outside the window, and I was holding her hand, and her hand was warm, and then it wasn't. The hospice nurse said it was peaceful. It was peaceful. I want to be clear about that. The dying was peaceful. Everything that came after was not. The funeral was 3 days later. Warren came. Brenda, his wife, came. My mother, Vivian, came with Dale, and Dale wore a suit that was too tight and shook everyone's hand like he was running for office. After the burial at the house on Birch Lane, Warren sat me down at the kitchen table and set a document in front of me and said, "I need to talk to you about the will." The document was a will. Dated 4 months before Grandmother May's death, it left the house on Birch Lane, the savings account, everything to Warren. It was signed by Grandmother May. It was notarized. It had 2 witness signatures. It looked official. It looked real. I stared at it and I felt the kitchen tilt, the way a room tilts when you stand up too fast, and I said, "This isn't right." She left the house to me. "There's another will." Judith Mercer drew it up. Warren shook his head. He said, "This is the most recent will, Nora. It supersedes the old one." Grandma changed her mind. I said she didn't change her mind. She would have told me. He said she didn't want to hurt your feelings. He said she knew you couldn't maintain the property. He said she wanted it to go to someone who could handle it. Brenda was standing by the sink. She didn't say anything. She was looking at her phone. My mother, Vivian, was at the table, and she said, "And this is the part I need you to hear, because this is the part that stayed." She said, "You always were the slow one, Nora. Even May knew it." Why do you think she changed the will? I didn't cry. I wanted to. My throat was doing that thing where it closes up, and you can feel the pressure behind your eyes like water behind a dam, but I didn't cry because I was too confused to cry and too tired to fight, and because the document looked real, and Warren was my brother, and my mother was sitting right there, and I was 28 years old, and I'd been taking care of my grandmother for 9 years, and I'd slept 4 hours a night for the last 6 months, and I couldn't think straight, and I couldn't find the words, and so I did what I always did. I didn't fight. Warren filed the will with Halloran County Probate Court on March 12th. I couldn't afford a lawyer. I called Judith Mercer's office, and the line was disconnected. She'd retired 2 years ago, moved to Florida, and her files had been transferred to a storage unit in Westbrook that had flooded. The original will was gone. I had no copy. I had nothing. Probate accepted Warren's will. The house transferred. On April 1st, Warren came to the house with a moving truck and Brenda and a manila envelope containing a 60-day notice to vacate. He said he was sorry. He said it was what Grandma wanted. He said, "You've had a free place to live for 9 years, Nora. It's time to figure it out." Brenda was already upstairs opening closets. I moved into my car. A 2009 Honda Civic with 147,000 miles on it and a passenger window that didn't roll up all the way. I parked at the Walmart on Route 9 for the first week because the lot was lit and there was a bathroom, and the security guard, a man named Hector who looked like he'd seen everything twice, would knock on my window at 5 a.m. and say, "Lots clearing, sweetheart, time to move." I'd nod and he'd walk away. And I'd sit in the driver's seat, and the seat was shaped to my body by then the way a shoe shapes to a foot, and I'd think, this is my bed now. This seat, this wheel, this cracked window that let in the April air, which was not warm, which was the kind of air that sits in your chest and doesn't leave. I showered at the YMCA on Clifton Avenue, where I'd bought a month pass for $38. The water was always too hot or too cold, never in between, and the drains were slow, and the soap they provided was the color of oatmeal and smelled like nothing. I'd stand under the water and count to 60 and then get out because the locker room had mirrors and I didn't want to look in the mirrors because the person in the mirrors was someone I didn't recognize. Hollow-eyed, the collarbones too sharp, the hair lank and unwashed even after washing and I didn't want to know her. I ate gas station sandwiches and bananas and the free cookies they put out at the bank on Thursdays. The cookies were oatmeal raisin. I hate oatmeal raisin. I ate them anyway because they were free and because hunger doesn't have preferences. I looked for apartments, I looked for rooms, I looked for anything with a roof and a lock, but I had $1,840 in savings and the cheapest studio in Halloran County was $895 a month. And every application wanted first, last, and a deposit, which was $2,685, which was $845 more than I had, and the gap between what I had and what I needed was the width of a sidewalk, and I couldn't cross it. I remember one night, it was the 11th night, a Wednesday. I parked behind the Pinewood Library because the Walmart lot had a patrol that night, and I needed somewhere dark and quiet. The library was closed. The parking lot was empty, except for me and a cat that sat on the hood of my car for an hour, cleaning itself, completely unbothered by my presence, and I watched it through the windshield, and I thought, this cat has a warmer bed than I do. The cat left at midnight. I didn't sleep. I lay across the front seats with my jacket pulled over me and the cracked window letting in air that smelled like pavement and pine needles, and I stared at the headliner of the Civic, which had a water stain shaped like a hand, and I thought about Grandmother May's kitchen and the way the light came through the window and the way the rosemary smelled when she pinched a sprig off the bush, and I thought, I will never smell that again. The house is gone, the bush is gone, everything I had is gone, and I'm lying in a car behind a library, and my brother is sleeping in my bed. I went to my mother. I drove to the condo in Westbrook, 31 miles east, and I stood on the doorstep, and I rang the bell, and Dale answered, and he looked at me like I was a solicitor, and I said, I need to talk to Mom, and he said, she's busy, and I said, please, and he closed the door. I sat on the step for 40 minutes. My mother came out. She was wearing a housecoat, and she smelled like the coffee Dale made, strong and burnt. She said, you can't stay here, Nora. I said, I'm not asking to stay. I'm asking for help. I said, Warren forged the will. Grandma didn't change her mind. She would have told me. My mother looked at me the way you look at a stain you've decided to ignore. She said, you always were the slow one. She said, Warren has a career. Warren has a family. Warren can take care of the house. You can barely take care of yourself. She went inside. The door closed. The lock turned. I sat on the step, and I could smell the coffee through the window, and I thought, she's not going to open that door again. I found it by accident. I was at the Pinewood Library on Clifton Avenue, the one Grandmother May used to run, the one where I'd spent every afternoon from age 9 to 18, using their computer to search for legal aid when I searched the notary name on Warren's will, Constance Reyes. The search returned an obituary. Constance Reyes, notary public, had died on January 14th, 14 months before the date on Warren's will. She'd been dead for over a year when she supposedly notarized Grandmother May's signature. The notary stamp was a ghost. The will was a forgery. I printed the obituary. I held it in my hands, and the paper was warm from the printer, and I could feel my heartbeat in my fingertips. And for the first time in 5 weeks, I felt something that wasn't numbness. I felt the ground. I drove to the house on Birch Lane. It was 11:47 p.m. The lights were on. Warren's Lexus was in the driveway. I let myself in with the key under the mat. The key I told Grandmother May 100 times to move, the key that was still there because nobody in my family ever listened to me about anything. Warren was in the kitchen. He was sitting at the table where Grandmother May had read to me, and he was on his laptop, and there was a glass of wine, and the rosemary bush was gone from outside the window. He'd pulled it out, I found out later, because Brenda said it attracted bugs. I set the obituary on the table. I said the notary on your will died a year before the date. You forged it. Warren looked at the paper. He looked at me, and his face did something I'd never seen. It went still, not surprised, not scared, still. The way a calculator goes still between operations. He said, you shouldn't have come here, Nora. I said, I'm going to the probate court tomorrow. I'm going to tell them the will is forged. I have proof. He stood up. He was between me and the door. He said, you don't have proof. You have an obituary. That's not proof. That's a piece of paper. I said it's enough to open an investigation. He said you can't afford an investigation. I said I'll find a way. He said, no, you won't. He pushed me. Not hard. Not the way you'd push someone in a fight. The way you'd move something that was in your way. So a chair, a box, a person who'd never fought back. I stumbled backward. The basement door was behind me. It was open. I'd opened it when I came in, out of habit, the way I always did when I came home, because the basement light switch was inside the door and Grandmother May liked the basement light on. The stairs were steep and wooden and unlit. I fell. I fell the way you fall when your feet go out from under you and your hands don't catch anything, because there's nothing to catch. I hit the third step, then the seventh, then the concrete floor. My left leg bent at an angle that legs don't bend. The pain was white, not sharp, white, like looking into a light. Warren came down the stairs. He stood over me. He looked at me the way he'd looked at the obituary. The same stillness, the same calculation. He didn't call 911. He didn't kneel down. He took my phone out of my jacket pocket. He took my jacket. It was April, but the basement was unheated and the concrete was cold, and the cold came up through my clothes and into my bones the way the tile had come up through my palms the day I sat on Grandmother May's kitchen floor and cried. He went back upstairs. He closed the door. I heard the lock turn. I lay on the basement floor and I looked up at the underside of the kitchen door, and I could see the light through the crack, and I could smell the mildew and the old laundry detergent Grandmother May used to keep on the shelf, and I could feel the cold climbing my body like water filling a glass, and I thought, this is where I die. In the basement of the house I grew up in, on the floor in the dark, with a broken leg and no phone and no coat, and my brother's footsteps above me, getting fainter, and the rosemary bush gone from the window and nobody coming. The last thing I thought was stupid. The last thing I thought was I should have moved the key. The last thing I felt was the cold. I woke up on the kitchen floor, not the basement, the kitchen. The tile under my cheek was different, warmer, sunlit, and the smell was rosemary. Fresh rosemary, cut the way it smelled when Grandmother May pinched a sprig off the bush for a roast. I opened my eyes. The kitchen was the kitchen on Birch Lane. The table was there. The window was there. The rosemary bush was outside the window, green and alive and enormous, the way it had been before Warren pulled it out. My phone was on the counter. I reached for it. The screen said September 14th, 6:22 a.m. 18 months before March 3rd. 18 months before Grandmother May died. 18 months before the forged will. 18 months before the basement. I pressed my hand flat against the tile. It was warm. The sun was coming through the window at the angle it came through in September, the angle Grandmother May had loved. The angle, she said, made the kitchen look like a painting. I could hear her breathing in the next room. That shallow, steady breathing she had in the mornings before she was fully awake, the breathing I'd listened to for 9 years through the wall between our rooms. She was alive, and I was alive, and it was September 14th, and I had 18 months. I lay on the floor for a long time. The rosemary smell was in my nose, and the sun was on my hand, and I could feel the tile warm and smooth, and I cried. Not the choking kind, the quiet kind, the kind where your body just lets go because it finally can. I cried until the tile was wet, and then I stopped and I wiped my face with the back of my hand, and I stood up and I looked at the kitchen and I made a list in my head, not a plan, a list. The way you make a list when you've been given a second chance and you know the way you know the stove is hot that you will not get a third. Number 1, the will. The original will, the one Judith Mercer had drawn up 12 years ago, the one that left everything to me. I needed a copy. I needed it notarized, witnessed, and lodged with the probate court before Warren could produce a forgery. I needed it on record. I needed it somewhere Warren couldn't reach. Number 2, Grandmother May. Her handwriting was already starting to wander. In the first life, I'd been too busy to notice what that meant. Now I knew. Warren had been sitting with her, talking to her, pressuring her for months. I needed to document her true wishes. I needed witnesses. I needed video data. Number 3, me. I needed to stop being the person who didn't fight. I needed to stop being the person who was too tired. I needed to build something, a job, a savings account, a life that wasn't dependent on the house on Birch Lane. I needed to become someone my family wouldn't recognize. Number 4, Warren. I needed to let him think nothing had changed. I needed to let him visit. I needed to let him sit in the kitchen and talk to Grandmother May in his low voice. I needed to watch. I needed to document. I needed to let him build his forgery step by step, because a forgery in progress is evidence and a forgery completed is a crime, and I needed both. Number 5, the basement door. I needed to install a lock, a deadbolt on the outside, and I needed to never stand at the top of those stairs with my back to the door. I called Judith Mercer's office. The line was still connected. She hadn't retired yet. She was still practicing, still above the bakery on Clifton Avenue, still drawing up wills in the same office where Grandmother May had sat 12 years ago. I made an appointment for that afternoon. I told Grandmother May I was going to the grocery store. I drove to Clifton Avenue and I parked the Civic. The same Civic, 142,000 miles, the same passenger window. And I walked into Judith Mercer's office and I said, my name is Nora Calloway and my grandmother is May Calloway. And she has a will that you drew up 12 years ago. And I need a certified copy and I need to lodge it with the Halloran County Probate Court immediately. Judith Mercer was 67 and she wore reading glasses on a chain, and she smelled like the lemon polish Grandmother May used, and she looked at me over the glasses and she said, your grandmother is still alive. I said yes. She said you can't lodge a will with probate while the testator is living. I said, I know. She said, then what do you want? I said, I want a certified copy. I want a second original. I want you to keep one in your safe, and I want to keep one, and I want to register the will with the county registry of wills as the most current expression of my grandmother's testamentary intent. She said, that's unusual. I said, I know. She said, why? I said, because someone is going to try to forge a new one. She didn't ask how I knew. She looked at me for a long time, and then she opened her safe and she pulled out the original will, and she made a certified copy, and she watched me sign the registry form, and she said, if anyone produces a will that conflicts with this one, the court will have to determine which is valid. I said, I know. She said, the original will is presumed valid unless the newer will is properly executed and authenticated. I said, I know that too. She said, you sound like you've been through this before. I said, I have. She didn't ask what I meant. The next day, I bought a security camera, a small one, the kind that looks like a smoke detector, from a hardware store on Route 9. I installed it in the kitchen above the window, angled at the table. I told Grandmother May it was a carbon monoxide detector. She said, oh, that's thoughtful, Nora. I also bought a digital recorder the size of a pen, and I kept it in my jacket pocket. Every time Warren visited, and he visited 3 times in October, 4 times in November, I turned it on. I recorded him sitting at the table talking to Grandmother May about the house, about the property values, about how hard it must be for Nora to maintain a place this size, about how he could help, about how he could take care of everything. His voice was calm. His voice was the same voice he'd used when he'd said, you shouldn't have come here. Nora, I recorded all of it. I labeled each file with the date and the time. I backed them up on a flash drive I kept in my sock drawer. In November, I enrolled in the accelerated nursing program at St. Catherine's Hospital. It was a 16-month
BSN track for students who already held a bachelor's. I had a bachelor's in health sciences. I'd finished online piece by piece between shifts because even someone who's slow gets there eventually. The program cost $28,400. I didn't have $28,400. I had $1,840. I applied for financial aid. I applied for every grant I could find. I got a Pell Grant for $6,895 and a hospital partnership scholarship for $12,000, and I took out a federal loan for the rest, and I started classes on November 3rd while still working part-time as a home health aide through an agency that paid $17.50 an hour. I slept 5 hours a night instead of 4. I drank coffee that tasted like burned plastic from the machine in the hospital break room, the kind of coffee that stains the cup and leaves a film on your tongue that you can taste at 3 a.m. when you're trying to sleep and can't because your brain won't stop running medication interactions. I studied on the bus. I studied in the laundry room while the machine ran.
I studied at the kitchen table while Grandmother May watched her shows, and Warren sat across from her and talked about property values in a voice I was recording. The first semester almost broke me. Pharmacology on Mondays, pathophysiology on Wednesdays, clinical rotations at St. Catherine's on Fridays, 12-hour shifts on the med-surg floor where I changed dressings and took vitals and pretended I wasn't the kind of person who'd once lived in her car. The other students were 22 and lived in dorms and complained about the cafeteria food, and I'd sit in the back of the lecture hall with my second-hand textbook. So $94, water damaged, the pages wavy. And I'd think, you have no idea. You have no idea what it's like to not have a door you can lock. But I didn't say it. I took notes. I highlighted things. I passed the first exam with an 84, which wasn't the best grade in the class, but was the best grade I'd ever gotten in anything, because I'd taken it on 3 hours of sleep and a granola bar and the memory of a basement floor, and an 84 felt like a door opening. December. Warren brought a man to the house. I was in the living room studying, and I heard them in the kitchen all say, Warren, and a voice I didn't recognize, a man's voice, low and professional. I turned on the recorder in my pocket. I crept to the hallway. The man was a notary, not Constance Reyes. She was still alive at this point. She wouldn't die until January, but a different notary, a man whose name I didn't catch. He was there to notarize something. I heard Warren say, Just sign here, Grandma. It's a power of attorney, so I can help you with the bills. Grandmother May said I don't need help with the bills. Nora handles the bills. Warren said Nora's busy with school. Let me help. Grandmother May said, well, all right. The notary stamped something. I stood in the hallway and my hands were shaking and my throat was tight and I pressed my back against the wall. Because the hallway was narrow and the wall was solid and I needed something solid because the floor felt like it was tilting, I called Ruth, not Ruth Greer, a different Ruth Achterberg, the estate attorney Judith Mercer had recommended when I'd asked who she'd trust with a forgery case. Ruth Achterberg worked at a firm called Achterberg & Lowe 12 miles north, in a converted Victorian with a porch that smelled like cedar. I drove there after class on December 19th. I brought the recordings, I brought the certified copy of the will, I brought the registry filing. Ruth listened to the December recording 3 times. She said a power of attorney obtained from an elderly person under pressure while the person's judgment may be impaired is potentially voidable for undue influence. She said the fact that your grandmother said she didn't need help and your brother pushed until she agreed is evidence of coercion. She said the notary's presence suggests he's building a paper trail. She said he's not going to forge a will, he's going to forge a power of attorney and use it to transfer the deed while your grandmother is alive. That's cleaner, that's harder to challenge. I said, what do I do? She said, document every visit, document every conversation, document the names of everyone he brings to the house, and keep your grandmother's true wishes on record. She said, can your grandmother state her wishes clearly? I said yes. On good days, yes. Ruth said, get it on video, not secretly, openly. Tell her what it's for. Let her say it in her own words. A video of the testator expressing her wishes while she's lucid is some of the strongest evidence you can have in a will contest. I did it on January 7th, a Wednesday. Grandmother May was having a good day. Her handwriting was steady. Her eyes were clear. She'd made tea that morning without help. I set up my phone on the kitchen table. I said, "Grandma, I need to ask you something, and I need you to say it in your own words, and I need to record it." She said, "What is it, sweetheart?" I said, "Who do you want to leave the house to?" She looked at me like I'd asked her if the sky was blue. She said, "The house goes to you, Nora. You've been here. You've taken care of me." She said, "I drew up a will with Judith Mercer years ago. It's all in there. The house, the savings, the rosemary." She laughed. She said especially the rosemary. I said, "Has anyone asked you to change the will?" She paused. Her face did something. Not confusion, not exactly. More like a person remembering something they'd decided to forget. She said, "Warren brought some papers." I said, "What papers?" She said, "He said it was a power of attorney for the bills." She said I signed it, but I didn't really want to. He was very insistent. I said, "When was this, Grandma?" She said, "December. A man came. He had a stamp." I had it. 12 minutes of video. Grandmother May, lucid, clear, stating her wishes, naming the will, naming Judith Mercer, naming Warren's papers, naming the man with the stamp. Ruth filed a petition to void the December power of attorney on January 14th. The same day, Constance Reyes died in the first life, though I didn't know that then, and it doesn't matter. The petition alleged undue influence and lack of capacity. Ruth submitted the video, she submitted the recordings, she submitted the certified copy of the original will and the registry filing. The court issued a temporary restraining order preventing Warren from using the power of attorney to transfer any assets. Warren was served on January 20th. He called me that night. His voice was calm. He said, "What are you doing, Nora?" I said, "I'm protecting Grandma's wishes." He said, "Grandma's wishes are whatever she says they are." I said she said what she said. On video, in her own words, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, you never fight, and now you're fighting, and I don't understand." I said, "I know you don't. Grandmother May died on March 3rd, a Tuesday. She was in her bed in the room with the rosemary bush outside the window, and I was holding her hand, and her hand was warm, and then it wasn't. The hospice nurse said it was peaceful. It was peaceful. The dying was peaceful. But this time, when the peace came, I was ready. I had the will. I had the video. I had the recordings. I had the certified copy and the registry filing and the restraining order and Ruth Achterberg's number on speed dial. And I had 18 months of evidence in a manila folder in a fireproof lockbox under my bed. Warren produced his will on March 10th, a will dated November 15th, 4 months before Grandmother May's death, signed by Grandmother May, notarized by a man named Gerald Forsythe. 2 witnesses, Brenda Calloway and a man named Thomas Pell. The will left the house, the savings, everything to Warren. Ruth had expected this. She'd told me he'll produce a will, not a power of attorney. The POA was the practice run. The will is the performance, but Ruth had already lodged the original will with the probate court. She'd filed it the day after Grandmother May died. The court had 2 wills. The court had to determine which was valid. The hearing was set for April 18th. Ruth hired a forensic document examiner named Dr. Anjali Patel, who analyzed the signature on Warren's will. Dr. Patel was a small woman with wire-rimmed glasses and a voice that could cut glass, and she'd examined 340 documents in disputed estate cases over 12 years. She took the will to her lab on Clifton Avenue and studied it under a microscope for 3 days. She found that the signature had been traced, the pen pressure was inconsistent, the letter formations matched a technique called simulation tracing, where you place a genuine signature under a light box and trace over it. The M in May matched the M on a birthday card Grandmother May had signed in October, which Warren had apparently used as a template. The downstroke of the M was identical sa pagkiowa zenyo, same angle, same length, same slight leftward lean at the bottom. Dr. Patel said it was a 94% structural match. She said genuine signatures vary. Forged ones don't because the tracer's trying too hard to be accurate, and the effort of trying produces a consistency that real handwriting never has. She said the birthday card was the template. She could see the indentation from the tracing tool, a stylus, probably, or a pen with no ink, pressed into the cardstock beneath the signature line. The notary, Gerald Forsythe, turned out to be a man who'd lost his commission 2 years ago for notary fraud in a neighboring county. He'd notarized 16 fraudulent mortgage documents for a title company that didn't exist. He was still operating illegally, charging $200 per stamp for people who needed documents notarized without questions. Warren had found him through a man at his real estate office, a colleague who'd used Forsyth for a property transfer that smelled wrong. Forsyth charged $1,200 for the notary stamp on the forged will. He'd never met Grandmother May. He'd never seen her sign anything. He'd stamped a blank page and handed it to Warren in a parking lot behind a gas station on Route 14, the same road my father had driven off the night he died. Thomas Pell, the second witness, was Brenda's cousin. Brenda, when deposed, said she'd signed as a witness but had not actually seen Grandmother May sign the will. She said Warren had asked her to sign, and she'd signed because he'd said it was routine. She said she'd assumed Grandmother May had signed it at some other time. She said she didn't know the notary was fake. She said she didn't ask. When Ruth asked her why she didn't ask, Brenda said, "Because Warren told me not to worry about it." She said it the way you'd say, because it was raining, like it was a fact that required no further explanation, like of course you don't ask, of course you sign, of course you do what Warren says because Warren is the one with the degree and the Lexus and you're just the wife and wives don't ask. Ruth also found the power of attorney from December. The one Grandmother May had said she didn't really want to sign, Ruth had it voided. The court found that Grandmother May had been subjected to undue influence and that her capacity at the time was questionable. The voiding was entered as evidence in the will contest. The pattern was clear. Warren had been building a paper trail, pressuring an elderly woman, and when that hadn't worked fast enough, he'd forged a will. The hearing was April 18th, a Friday. Halloran County Probate Court, 2nd floor, Department 7. The courtroom smelled like floor wax and old carpet and the coffee the bailiff had brought in a thermos. There were 32 people in the gallery, and mostly other families waiting for their cases, but also a reporter from the Halloran County Register who Ruth had tipped off because Ruth understood that some things need to happen in public to matter. I wore the navy blazer. I'd bought it at a consignment store on Clifton Avenue for $34. I'd had my hair cut the week before. Short, clean, the kind of cut that says, I don't have time for this. I was 28 and I looked different than I had 18 months ago. I'd gained 8 pounds back from the weight I'd lost in the first life. My skin was clear, my hands were steady. I was 3 months from finishing my BSN. I had $14,500 in savings and a job offer from St. Catherine's and a fireproof lockbox and a navy blazer, and I was standing in the hallway of the probate court, and Warren was walking toward me. And he didn't recognize me. He walked right past me. He was 10 feet beyond me before he stopped and turned and looked again, and I watched his face do the thing, the blankness, the calculation, the recalibration, and I watched him realize that the woman in the navy blazer with the short hair and the steady hands was the sister. He'd pushed down a flight of stairs, and his mouth opened and nothing came out. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. Ruth was already at the counsel table. The judge was already on the bench. The hearing started at 9 a.m. Warren's attorney presented the forged will. Ruth presented the original. The judge looked at both. Ruth called Dr. Patel, who testified about the traced signature. Ruth called Judith Mercer, who testified about the original will and identified her own drafting notations. Ruth played the video. 12 minutes of Grandmother May, clear-eyed, saying the house goes to Nora. Ruth played the December recording. Warren's voice, calm and insistent, saying, just sign here, Grandma. Ruth presented the voided power of attorney. Ruth presented Brenda's deposition. Ruth presented Gerald Forsyth's revoked notary commission. The whole thing took 90 minutes. Warren's attorney tried to argue that the original will had been superseded. Ruth said, superseded by what? A forgery? The judge looked at the forensic report. The judge looked at the video. The judge looked at the voided power of attorney. The judge looked at Warren. Warren was standing. His attorney was beside him. The judge said, the will dated November 15th is a forgery. The signature has been traced. The notary's commission was revoked at the time of notarization. One witness has testified she did not observe the testator sign. The court finds the original will, drafted by Judith Mercer and registered with the county, to be the valid and controlling expression of the decedent's testamentary intent. The house on Birch Lane, the savings account, and all associated assets are awarded to Nora Calloway. The judge then referred the matter to the Halloran County District Attorney's Office for investigation of forgery, fraud, and elder exploitation. A bailiff moved toward Warren. Warren looked at me. His face was doing the still thing and the calculator between operations, but this time the calculation wasn't landing. This time the numbers weren't working. He said, "Nora," and his voice cracked, the same way it hadn't cracked in the first life, the same way it had stayed calm while I lay on the basement floor. He said, "We can fix this. I can explain." I said, "You said I never fight." He stared at me. I said, "I'm fighting." They escorted him out. I watched him go. He was wearing the gray suit he'd worn to Grandmother May's funeral, the same suit he'd worn when he'd sat me down at the kitchen table and set the forged will in front of me, and the suit looked the same, and the man looked smaller. Brenda was in the gallery. She was looking at her hands. My mother, Vivian, was not there. She hadn't come. I'd called her the night before. I'd said the hearing is tomorrow, Mom. She'd said I don't think I should be there. She'd said it's between you and Warren. I'd said it was always between me and Warren, and you picked his side. She'd hung up. Warren was charged with forgery, fraud, and exploitation of an elderly person. The forensic evidence was overwhelming. The video was damning. The recordings were clear. Brenda cooperated with the prosecution in exchange for immunity. Thomas Pell testified that Warren had paid him $500 to sign as a witness. Gerald Forsyth testified that Warren had paid him $1,200 for the notary stamp. The attorney who'd helped Warren draft the power of attorney, a different attorney, not Judith Mercer, a man named Kessler who operated out of a strip mall, testified that Warren had specifically asked for language that would allow real estate transfer. Every person Warren had paid, every document he'd forged, every conversation he'd recorded himself, having all of it became evidence. The tools he'd built to take the house became the evidence that put him in a cell. The trial took 3 weeks. Warren's attorney argued financial pressure, family conflict, a mistake. The jury didn't buy it. The tracing was too precise. The payments to the fake notary and the fake witness were too deliberate. The power of attorney had been obtained 2 months before the forged will. The visits to Grandmother May had been increasing in frequency for 6 months. The recording showed a pattern of escalating pressure. This wasn't a mistake. This was a campaign. Warren was sentenced to 4 years for forgery and fraud and 3 years for elder exploitation to run consecutively, 7 years. He stood in the courtroom and he looked at me, the same look, the calculator, the stillness, and I looked back and I felt the ground, solid, warm, mine. After the sentencing, I drove to Birch Lane. I parked the Civic in the driveway, the same Civic, 161,000 miles now, the same passenger window, and I sat in the car for a while. The rosemary bush was by the front steps. Green, enormous, alive. I could smell it through the cracked window, that sharp, clean smell, the smell of the kitchen when Grandmother May was cooking, the smell of the first day of the rest of my life. I got out of the car, I walked to the bush, I pinched off a sprig the way she used to, and I held it under my nose and I breathed, and the smell was so real and so present and so hers that I had to put my hand on the porch railing to steady myself. I went inside. The house was empty. Warren had moved out after the restraining order. The kitchen was the same. The table was the same. The window was the same. The light came through at the September angle and made the trapezoid of gold on the floor, and I stood in it and I pressed my hand flat against the tile. The kitchen tile, not the basement tile. The warm tile, not the cold. And it was warm and I was alive and the tile was just tile. I opened the basement door. I looked down the stairs. They were steep and wooden and unlit. I stood there for a long time. My left leg ached a phantom ache, an echo, the memory of an angle that legs don't bend. I reached into my jacket and I pulled out the deadbolt I'd bought at the hardware store and I installed it on the outside of the basement door. It took 20 minutes. The screws were short and the wood was old, and I had to use a longer screw for the bottom hole. When I turned the key, the bolt slid home with a sound solid final, the sound of a door that won't open from the inside, and I put the key in my pocket and I closed the door and the stairs were on the other side and I was on this side and that was the end of that. I called my mother. It was the first time I'd called her since the hearing. She answered on the third ring. I said, Warren was sentenced today. She was quiet. I said 7 years. She said, I know. I said, you said I was the slow one. She was quiet. I said, I was never slow. Mom, I was tired. There's a difference. She didn't say anything. I could hear Dale in the background, the television, the sound of a life that had nothing to do with mine. I said, I just wanted you to know. She said, Nora, and her voice was small, smaller than I'd ever heard it. The voice of a person who'd just been shown the shape of what they'd done. She said, I'm sorry. I said, I know. I hung up. I didn't forgive her. I might someday, but not today. Today, I was standing in a kitchen that smelled like rosemary, and the tile was warm, and the deadbolt was installed, and the will was mine, and the house was mine, and the life was mine, and I was done being the person who didn't fight. The first time I died on a basement floor with a broken leg, and no coat and no phone, and a brother's footsteps fading above me. The second time I had a deadbolt, and a lawyer, and a manila folder, and a navy blazer, and 18 months of evidence, and a house that smelled like rosemary. Trust isn't weakness, but trusting someone who's already shown you who they are, that's not trust, that's resignation wearing a family name. Some locks aren't meant to be opened, they're meant to be installed by the person who survived the stairs. If this story reminded you of a time your family chose a side that wasn't yours, or a time you were too tired to fight and someone used that tiredness against you, tell me about it in the comments. I read everyone, and if you want to hear what happens when the quiet ones finally stop being quiet, subscribe.